I hadn't planned on running into my past. In fact, the entire reason I moved into this new apartment was to leave it all behind. Messy relationships, old heartbreaks, all of it. This place was supposed to be my fresh start, a chance to focus on myself for once, without the baggage of old wounds. So, of course, it only took 3 days for my past to come crashing back in. I was carrying a box of books up to my new place when I first saw him. The hallway was quiet, just the low hum of someone's TV and the faint scent of someone else's dinner wafting from another unit. As I fumbled with the keys, trying to balance the box on one hip, the door across the hall swung open, and there he was, Ethan. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was someone who looked like him, a cruel coincidence, the kind the universe loves to throw at you when you're least expecting it. But then he turned, and his eyes met mine. No, it wasn't a trick. My heart stuttered in my chest. He was exactly the same, and yet completely different. His hair was a little shorter, his face a little sharper, but those eyes, those same dark eyes that had once seen right through me, hadn't changed at all. And the shock in them told me he hadn't expected this reunion any more than I had. We stood there, frozen in place, for what felt like an eternity. The world outside seemed to fade, the bustling noise of the city dimming as everything around me narrowed to this one moment. I had never imagined I'd see him again. Not like this. Not after how things ended between us. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Sarah? The sound of my name, his voice after all this time, sent a jolt through me. I gripped the box tighter, as if it could somehow anchor me in the moment. Ethan, I finally managed, my voice coming out more uncertain than I wanted. What are you doing here? He glanced down at the ground, shifting uncomfortably. I live here, in 4B. Of course he did. My ex-boyfriend, the man who had left me heartbroken and confused years ago, was now my neighbor. The one person I thought I'd never have to deal with again. The awkwardness hung between us like a thick fog, and I didn't know what to say. A million questions bubbled up in my mind. Why are you here? Why didn't you call? Why did you leave the way you did? But none of those questions felt right in the moment. The hallway wasn't the place to unravel old wounds, and I wasn't ready to hear the answers. Not yet. I didn't know you lived here, I finally said, stating the obvious just to fill the silence. Yeah, I moved in a few months ago. He looked like he wanted to say more, but the words seemed stuck somewhere between us, buried under years of silence. I shifted the box in my arms, feeling the weight of everything, both literal and emotional. Well, I just moved in. Apartment 4D. Right across the hall, he said, almost to himself. He scratched the back of his neck, the way he used to when he was nervous. I couldn't take it anymore. The memories, the unresolved feelings. It was too much all at once. I nodded stiffly, forcing a polite smile. It was nice seeing you, Ethan. I should, get back to unpacking. Yeah, of course, he said quickly, stepping aside to let me pass. Good to see you too, Sarah. I moved past him, heart pounding, and practically slammed the door behind me once I was inside my apartment. I pressed my back against the door, taking a deep breath to steady myself. My mind was reeling. Out of all the buildings in the city, how had I ended up moving into the same one as him? Ethan had been my first serious relationship, the kind that feels like the center of your universe until it implodes. He had left without a real explanation, just a vague, it's complicated, and a disappearance from my life that left me spiraling. I had spent months trying to piece together what went wrong, wondering what I did, what I missed. And now, here he was, living right across the hall like nothing had changed. Over the next few days, I did my best to avoid him. I threw myself into unpacking, focusing on setting up my new space and settling into my new routine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this new beginning wasn't as clean a break as I'd hoped. Every time I left my apartment, I half expected to run into Ethan again. My nerves were on edge, and I couldn't stop replaying our brief encounter in the hallway. It didn't help that something about him seemed off. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but it wasn't that simple. Ethan had always been mysterious, but now there was a nervousness to him that I hadn't seen before. He was always looking over his shoulder, moving quickly through the hallways like he didn't want to be seen. I'd catch glimpses of him out my window, slipping out late at night, only to return hours later looking more tense than ever. On one particularly quiet evening, I heard him through the thin walls of our apartments. He was on the phone, his voice low but strained. I couldn't make out much of what he was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. He was worried or scared. It was like he was in the middle of something much bigger than him. I tried to push it out of my mind. Ethan's life was no longer my business, and I had promised myself I wouldn't get pulled back into his orbit. But the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. And then came the visitors. It started with one late-night knock at Ethan's door. A man, tall and muscular, wearing a dark coat, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. I saw him through the peephole, standing there for a long time before Ethan finally opened the door. Their conversation was short, but the tension was palpable. Ethan glanced nervously down the hall, and the man handed him a package before disappearing as quickly as he came. The next night, a different man appeared, this one older, with a scar down the side of his face. He stayed longer, his voice louder and more agitated. Ethan didn't say much, but I heard the door slam after he left. Something wasn't right. The final straw came a few days later. I had just gotten back from the grocery store when I saw her, Heather, my neighbor from down the hall. She was standing outside Ethan's door, knocking insistently, but no one answered. Her face was tight with frustration. "You waiting for someone?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Heather glanced over, her expression wary. "Ethan, but he's never around when I need him." "You two know each other well?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Heather looked me over, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You could say that. He's a bit of a mystery, isn't he?" I swallowed, unsure how much I wanted to reveal. "Yeah, we used to know each other." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I wouldn't get too close if I were you. Ethan's hiding something. Something big." I stared at her, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" Heather smirked, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "I've seen people come and go from his place. Not the kind of people you want to get involved with. And trust me, whatever Ethan's mixed up in, you don't want any part of it." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, my mind racing. Ethan wasn't just acting strange. He was hiding something. Something dark. And whether I liked it or not, I was about to find out what. What do you think Ethan is hiding? Would you try to get involved? Or would you walk away from your past? Leave a comment below. The rest of the week passed in a haze of tension. I tried to keep busy, focusing on work, unpacking, anything to distract myself. But the uneasy feeling that had settled over me refused to leave. Heather's words echoed in my mind. Ethan's hiding something. Something big. It was like a knot tightening in my chest. I didn't want to get involved, but it was impossible to ignore the signs that something was wrong. The strange visitors, the late-night phone calls, the way Ethan kept disappearing. Everything about him seemed off. But every time I considered knocking on his door and confronting him, the memories of our past made me hesitate. Did I really want to reopen that wound? I caught myself glancing at his door whenever I passed it, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or hear something that might explain the bizarre behavior. But Ethan had become a ghost in his own apartment, slipping in and out at odd hours. The more I tried to distance myself from it all, the more obsessed I became. It was Friday evening when things finally escalated. I had just returned from dinner with a few co-workers when I heard raised voices through the thin walls of my apartment. At first, I thought it was the TV in the next unit, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, I realized it was Ethan. and he wasn't alone. There were two voices, low and urgent, their conversation filled with sharp tension. I couldn't make out much, but I caught fragments. "This is getting out of hand, Ethan. They want results." "I know. I'm working on it. But you need to give me more time." "You don't have time. They're not patient. If you don't deliver, they'll come after you, and anyone connected to you." The threat in the stranger's voice sent a chill down my spine. I backed away from the wall, my pulse quickening. "Anyone connected to you? Could they mean me?" I paced my apartment, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd just overheard. Was Ethan really involved in something dangerous? The pieces were starting to fall into place, and none of them painted a pretty picture. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Ethan was mixed up in, it wasn't just affecting him. It was putting me at risk too. The next morning, I ran into Heather again. She was sitting on the stoop outside the building, her usual smirk replaced by a look of irritation. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing me as I stepped out the door. "Something like that," I muttered. I couldn't stop myself from asking, "What do you know about Ethan? What's he involved in?" Heather raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my sudden interest. "Why do you care?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "We used to be close, and I've noticed some things lately. It's hard to ignore." She let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, Ethan's good at making people think he's harmless. But trust me, whatever he's gotten himself into, it's not innocent. He's been receiving some pretty shady visitors, and from what I've gathered, they're not the type you want to mess with." My stomach twisted. "What kind of people?" Heather glanced around, lowering her voice. "You ever heard of money laundering? Smuggling?" I blinked, shocked. "You're saying Ethan's involved in that?" She shrugged. "I'm not saying anything for sure, but I've seen enough to know something's not right. You want my advice? Keep your distance. People like that, they drag you down with them. Whatever's going on behind that door, it's dangerous." I nodded, though my mind was racing. Could Ethan really be mixed up in something illegal? It seemed so far removed from the person I had once known. But then again, he had always kept parts of his life hidden from me. Maybe this was one of those parts, something he had buried so deep that I never saw it coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me as I lay in bed, replaying the conversation I'd overheard. I tossed and turned, my mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. Finally, around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I threw on a hoodie and padded barefoot to the door, peeking through the peephole to make sure the hallway was clear. Ethan's door was closed, no signs of activity. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but then I steeled myself and stepped out into the hall. I knocked softly at first, unsure if he was even home. When there was no answer, I knocked again, harder this time. The door opened suddenly, and Ethan stood there, his face a mix of surprise and irritation. He was dressed in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, his hair disheveled as if he hadn't slept much either. "Sarah," he said, blinking as if he hadn't expected me to show up on his doorstep. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Can I come in?" Ethan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder into the apartment, then back at me. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, but then he stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I walked in, my heart pounding in my chest. His apartment was as sparsely decorated as I remembered from my brief glimpses. Bare walls, a single couch, and a small table covered with papers. But what caught my attention were the boxes stacked in the corner, some of them partially packed, like he was preparing to leave at a moment's notice. Ethan closed the door behind me, crossing his arms as he leaned against it. "What's this about, Sarah?" I took a deep breath, turning to face him. "I know something's going on, Ethan. You've been acting strange, and I've overheard things. People are coming to your apartment late at night, and it's not just casual visits. What are you involved in?" His face tightened, his eyes narrowing. You've been listening in on my conversations? I didn't mean to, I said quickly, though I knew how it sounded. But it's hard not to notice when someone's threatening you through the walls. Ethan looked away, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, brush me off like he had before. But then he sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of it all was finally too much to carry. You shouldn't have gotten involved, Sarah, he said quietly. This isn't something you can fix. Fix? I repeated, incredulous. Ethan, I'm not trying to fix anything. I just want to know what's going on. I deserve that much. He hesitated, his jaw clenching as if he was warring with himself. Finally, he looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. You're right, he said, his voice low. I owe you the truth. I held my breath, waiting for him to continue. I got involved with some people a while back. After we broke up, he began, his tone measured but tense. At first, it was just work, something to make money, to keep me afloat. But it got complicated. I started doing things I shouldn't have, things I didn't even fully understand at the time. What kind of things? I asked, dreading the answer. He looked away, the shame evident on his face. Money laundering. Smuggling. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, but I got in too deep. And now they want more from me. I tried to back out, but they don't let people leave. The room seemed to spin around me. Money laundering? Smuggling? This was Ethan, the man I had once loved, telling me he was involved in criminal activity like it was a casual confession. The shock and fear hit me all at once. You should have told me, I whispered, my voice shaking. You should have warned me before I moved in here. I know, he said, his voice heavy with regret, but I didn't want you to get hurt. I thought if I stayed distant, if I kept you out of it, you'd be safe. Safe? I scoffed, taking a step back. Ethan, I've been living right across the hall from you. How am I supposed to be safe when you're in the middle of something like this? He ran a hand over his face, clearly frustrated. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I've been trying to protect you, but I don't know how much longer I can keep them at bay. Who's them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's face darkened. The people I work for. They're not just going to let me walk away. And now that you've gotten involved, they might see you as leverage. A wave of cold fear washed over me. Leverage? What do you mean? They've started asking questions about you, Sarah, Ethan said quietly. They know we used to be together. They think they can use you to control me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart raced, the full weight of what he was saying sinking in. I wasn't just in danger because of Ethan's choices. I was a target now. What do we do? I asked, the panic rising in my chest. How do we stop them? Ethan looked at me, his face grim. We don't stop them. We run. What would you do if you were Sarah? Would you run with Ethan? Or try to find another way out? Let us know what you think should happen next. Ethan's words hung in the air like a cold fog. We run. The simplicity of it was terrifying. How had my life spiraled into this? One minute, I was starting fresh, putting the past behind me, and now, I was standing in my ex-boyfriend's apartment, finding out I was a target in some criminal conspiracy. My mind raced, grasping for any sense of control, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Run? I echoed, my voice trembling. Run where? Ethan turned toward the window, his face drawn and tense. There's a safe house, he said, outside the city. I've been preparing for this, just in case. It's not much, but it'll keep us hidden long enough to figure out our next move. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. And what exactly is our next move, Ethan? How do we get out of this mess? He turned to me, his eyes dark with regret. There might not be a clean way out. These people, they don't just let you walk away. I've been trying to leave for months, but they keep pulling me back in. I didn't think they'd go after you. But now that they know you're involved, I'm not involved. I cut him off, anger flaring through my fear. You dragged me into this. I didn't choose any of it. Ethan flinched at my words, the guilt plain on his face. I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't want you to be a part of this. I never meant for you to get hurt. Hurt? I let out a bitter laugh. Ethan, I'm terrified. You're telling me that I've been watched, that my life is in danger because of something you did, and now the solution is to run? That's not a plan. That's desperation. Ethan's face hardened, his voice low. This isn't just about me anymore, Sarah. They're dangerous, and they'll come for you. We can't stay here. If we don't leave, they'll find us. And trust me, when they do, running will no longer be an option. His words cut through my anger, leaving only fear in their wake. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't just about unfinished business between us. This was about survival. My chest tightened as the weight of the situation settled over me. What if we go to the police? I asked, grasping for any other solution. Tell them everything? Ethan shook his head. They own the police, or at least enough of them to make that dangerous. I've thought about it, but it's too risky. We don't know who we can trust. I swallowed hard, the knot in my stomach tightening. So, we're really doing this. Running. Ethan nodded. I know it's not what you wanted to hear, but it's the only way. We can leave tonight, head for the safe house, lay low until we figure out our next step. I stared at him, my mind reeling. The thought of running with Ethan felt surreal. Years ago, I had imagined our lives going in a million different directions, but this wasn't one of them. Yet there was no denying the danger we were in. I could feel it, pressing in on all sides. The late-night visitors, the cryptic threats, Heather's warnings. It all pointed to something far bigger than I could have imagined. Fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We'll go. But if we're doing this, you have to tell me everything. No more secrets, no more half-truths. I need to know exactly what I'm getting myself into. Ethan met my eyes, his jaw tight, before nodding. I promise. No more secrets. We moved quickly after that. Ethan packed a bag with a few essentials while I rushed back to my apartment to grab whatever I could fit into a small duffel. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes and toiletries into the bag, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this really happening? Could I trust Ethan to keep me safe? As I zipped up the bag, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. I barely recognized myself. Just a few days ago, I had been excited about starting a new chapter in my life, hopeful that this apartment would be a fresh start. Now, I was on the verge of running from dangerous criminals, my life in shambles because of a man I thought I'd left behind. A soft knock on my door snapped me out of my thoughts. I opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression grim. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, slinging the bag over my shoulder. We left the building through the back exit, slipping out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, but every shadow felt like a threat. Ethan led the way, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to jump out at any moment. I followed close behind, my heart pounding with every step. His car was parked a few blocks away, hidden in a narrow alley. He unlocked it, and we climbed inside, the silence between us thick with tension. "How far is the safe house?" I asked as he started the engine. "About 2 hours," Ethan replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's isolated. No one will find us there." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. I wasn't just running from the danger. I was running toward the unknown, and I had no idea what would happen when we got there. The drive was tense, the city lights fading behind us as we made our way out into the countryside. Neither of us spoke much, the weight of what was happening pressing down on us. I kept glancing at Ethan, trying to read his expression, but his face was set in a hard, focused line. He had always been good at hiding his emotions, but now I wondered what he was thinking. Was he scared? Regretful? Or was he too far gone to feel anything but survival instinct? As the minutes ticked by, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to our past. We had been so close once, so deeply connected, and then he was gone. No explanation, no closure, just gone. And now, years later, here we were again, thrown together by circumstances I never could have imagined. I didn't know if I still loved him, but the memories were hard to shake. Finally, after what felt like hours of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. "Ethan," I said quietly, "what happened after we broke up? Why didn't you tell me the truth back then?" He kept his eyes on the road, but I saw his grip on the steering wheel tighten. "I didn't want to drag you into it. Things were already getting complicated, and I thought if I left, you'd be safe. I couldn't risk telling you everything." "But why now?" I asked, my voice wavering. "Why did you let me move into the same building without warning me? Why didn't you try to protect me sooner?" Ethan exhaled, a long, tired breath. "Because I didn't know how to fix it. I thought I could handle it on my own, keep you out of it. But they found out about you, Sarah. They started asking questions, watching you. That's when I knew I couldn't keep you safe from a distance anymore." I felt a lump form in my throat, my emotions bubbling to the surface. "I trusted you back then, Ethan, and you left me. Do you know what that did to me?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes still focused on the road ahead. But I saw the guilt in his expression, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I thought leaving was the only way to protect you. I thought maybe you'd be better off without me." I swallowed hard, trying to push down the anger and sadness that had built up over the years. "I don't know if I can forgive you for that." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. "I don't expect you to. But right now, the only thing that matters is keeping you safe." We drove in silence for the next hour, the weight of everything left unsaid hanging between us. The countryside stretched out before us, dark and empty, with only the occasional farmhouse breaking up the landscape. The further we got from the city, the more isolated it felt, like we were driving straight into the unknown. Finally, we pulled off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that led deep into the woods. The trees closed in around us, their shadows stretching across the road in long, eerie lines. I gripped the seat, my nerves on edge as we drove deeper into the forest. After what felt like an eternity, the cabin came into view. It was small and unassuming, nestled among the trees, with no lights and no sign of life. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Ethan parked the car and turned to me. "This is it. We should be safe here for now." I nodded, though the sight of the cabin only deepened my unease. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but the isolation of the place made me feel more vulnerable than ever. We grabbed our bags and headed inside. The air inside the cabin was cold and musty, the smell of dust and old wood filling my nostrils. Ethan quickly checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure, while I stood in the middle of the room, trying to steady my nerves. "This place," I began, my voice trailing off as I glanced around. "Is this really going to keep us safe?" Ethan looked at me, his face serious. "For now, but we need to stay low. No phone calls, no internet. We can't risk them finding us." I nodded, my mind spinning. This wasn't the life I had imagined. Hiding in a remote cabin, running from dangerous people, unsure of what the future held. But for now, it was the only option we had. Ethan sat down on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Sarah. I'm sorry you got dragged into this." I shook my head, sitting down beside him. "It's not just about what I want anymore. It's about survival." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and something else, something softer, more familiar. "We'll figure this out. Together." I wanted to believe him, I wanted to trust that we could get through this. But the truth was, I didn't know if we would. And as we sat there in the dim light of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still coming for us, something we couldn't outrun. What do you think will happen next? Will the safe house really protect them, or are they walking into more danger? Let us know your thoughts below. The cabin was cold, quiet, and still. Too still. I sat on the couch, my body tense, listening to every creak and groan of the old wooden structure. Every rustle of the wind outside, every whisper of the trees seemed like a threat lurking in the dark. Ethan had said this place was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were sitting ducks, just waiting for something to go wrong. Ethan was pacing near the window, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He kept glancing outside, his body coiled with tension. I could feel it, too, the pressure building, like something inevitable was creeping toward us. It was suffocating. "We can't stay here forever," I said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. Ethan stopped pacing, his jaw tight as he turned to face me. "I know, but we don't have many options right now. If we leave too soon, they'll track us. If we stay too long, they might figure out where we are." "Then what's the plan?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "You said we'd figure this out together, but I don't see how hiding here solves anything." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I'm working on it, Sarah. I just need time." "Time for what?" I stood up, my emotions bubbling to the surface. "You've been keeping me in the dark since the moment I saw you again. And now we're stuck here, waiting for something to happen, but you still won't tell me everything." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want to drag you into this, but now that you're involved, I'm trying to keep you safe. That's all I'm thinking about, keeping you alive." I could feel the anger and fear rising in my chest. "I get that you're trying to protect me, but I'm scared, Ethan. I'm scared because I don't know what's coming, or if I'll even survive this. I don't know if we'll ever get out of this mess." His face softened, and for a moment, I saw the Ethan I had once loved, the man who had held my heart before everything fell apart. He took a step closer, his voice quieter now. "We will get out of this. I swear." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that he could make this right, that he could protect me from the danger closing in. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't sure. He was holding it together for my sake. But the truth was, we were both drowning in something bigger than we could handle. Suddenly, a sharp noise outside shattered the silence. A crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Ethan's head snapped toward the window, his entire body going rigid. "Did you hear that?" My heart leaped into my throat. What was it? He moved to the window, peering through the curtains, his hand reaching instinctively for the small handgun he'd tucked into his waistband earlier. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the door. "Wait," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "You can't go out there alone." "I have to check," he said, his voice urgent. "If they found us, we need to know." Before I could argue, he slipped out the door, leaving me standing in the middle of the cabin, my heart pounding in my ears. The fear that had been simmering inside me now boiled over. I couldn't lose him. Not again. Not like this. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The quiet outside was unbearable, the tension tightening around me like a vice. I paced the room, my breath shallow, waiting for any sign of Ethan's return. Finally, the door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, his face pale and grim. "It's not safe here anymore," he said, his voice tight. "They found us." My stomach dropped. "What do we do?" "We leave. Now." We grabbed our bags and rushed out of the cabin, the cool night air biting at my skin. Ethan was moving quickly, his eyes scanning the woods as we made our way to the car. The silence of the forest felt eerie, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to strike. Just as we reached the car, a figure emerged from the trees. My heart froze. "Ethan, don't move," a cold voice called out. A man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with a gun drawn and aimed directly at Ethan. Two more men appeared behind him, their faces hard and unfeeling. They were here for him, and for me. "Get in the car, Sarah," Ethan whispered. His eyes locked on the man in front of him. "No one's going anywhere," the man said, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "You've made this too complicated, Ethan. We told you what would happen if you didn't deliver. And now, she's involved." My pulse raced. They were talking about me. I was the leverage Ethan had warned me about. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, Ethan stepped in front of me, shielding me from the men. "This is between you and me," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave her out of it." The man laughed. "You think you can bargain now? You're in no position to make demands, Ethan." Ethan's hand tightened around the gun at his side, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He couldn't win this. There were too many of them, and we were out in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help. "Sarah, get in the car," Ethan said again, his voice shaking with urgency. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but before I could move, one of the men lunged forward. Ethan reacted instantly, shoving me aside as he fired his gun. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees, and chaos erupted. The men opened fire. I ducked behind the car, my breath coming in short gasps, fear gripping every part of me. The sound of gunfire filled the air, and I couldn't see Ethan, couldn't tell if he was okay. My mind raced with a single thought: we're not going to survive this. I heard a grunt, and when I dared to peek over the edge of the car, I saw Ethan struggling with one of the men. Blood stained his shirt, and my stomach turned as I realized he'd been shot. But he was still fighting, still pushing forward. The world seemed to slow as Ethan locked eyes with me. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Go, Sarah. Get out of here." I froze, fear and shock paralyzing me. But then I saw the determination in his eyes, the silent plea. He wasn't going to make it. He was sacrificing himself to buy me time, and I couldn't let that be for nothing. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to move. I scrambled to my feet, throwing open the driver's door and sliding into the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but somehow, I managed to start the engine. I glanced back, my heart breaking as I saw Ethan still fighting, still trying to protect me. And then I drove. I drove away, the road a blur of trees and darkness, tears streaming down my face as Ethan's voice echoed in my mind. Hours later, I found myself sitting in a dingy motel room, alone. My hands still shook, and my heart ached in a way I had never experienced before. Ethan was gone. The man who had re-entered my life with a dark secret was gone, and I didn't even know if he was alive. I had escaped. I had survived. But at what cost? I pulled my phone from my bag, staring at the blank screen. There was no one to call, no one who would understand what had happened. I thought about going to the police, but Ethan had been right. They were too corrupt, too intertwined with the people who had hunted us. All I had now were questions and regrets. I didn't know if Ethan had made it out alive, or if I'd ever see him again. But one thing was certain: my life was no longer mine. It had been torn apart by a past I couldn't escape, and the man I had once loved had become a ghost I would carry with me forever. I sat in the silence of the motel room, trying to find some semblance of peace, but the only thing I could hear was Ethan's last word to me: "Run." Do you think Ethan survived? Would you have stayed and fought, or run to save yourself? Let us know how you feel about this intense ending. The night was too still. The cold air clung to my skin as we rushed toward the car, every shadow in the trees feeling like eyes watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the pounding in my chest made it hard to think clearly. I clutched my bag tightly, my mind racing. Ethan was moving ahead of me, his steps tense and hurried, but my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. When we reached the car, Ethan yanked open the door and threw our bags into the back seat. "We need to move fast," he muttered. "If they found us, it won't be long before." A crack echoed through the trees, loud and sharp, like the sound of a gunshot. My heart leapt into my throat. I whipped around, scanning the darkened woods, but it was impossible to see anything through the thick shadows. "Ethan?" I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. His face had gone pale. He took a step forward, placing himself between me and the trees, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his waist. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low, steady. "Now." Before I could move, a figure emerged from the darkness. I froze. He was tall, dressed in black, his face partially hidden under a hood. But I could see the glint of metal in his hand, the unmistakable shape of a gun. Behind him, two more men stepped out of the trees, their expressions hard and cold. My blood ran cold. They had found us. "Well, well," the man in the hood said, his voice a low growl. "Looks like you didn't run far enough, Ethan." I felt my knees go weak, the world spinning around me. This was it, the moment Ethan had been dreading, the moment I had feared since he told me the truth. Ethan stepped forward, his body tense, his hand still hovering near his gun. "This has nothing to do with her," he said, his voice tight. "Let her go. I'm the one you want." The man smirked. "You really think we're going to leave loose ends? She's part of this now. She knows too much." My heart pounded in my ears. I glanced at Ethan, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the weight of what was happening. Ethan shifted his stance, his hand finally gripping the gun at his side. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "We can settle this another way." The man's smirk widened. "I don't think so." And then everything happened at once. Ethan pulled his gun, but the man was faster. A shot rang out, piercing the night. I screamed, ducking instinctively as the echo of the gunfire reverberated through the trees. I saw Ethan stumble, his body jerking as the bullet hit him square in the chest. "No!" I cried, rushing toward him. But Ethan waved me off, his face contorted in pain. "Sarah, run!" he gasped, clutching his side, blood soaking through his shirt. The men started advancing, their eyes cold and merciless. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could see was Ethan, struggling to stand, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't going to make it. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet were frozen in place. I couldn't just leave him. Not like this. Not after everything. "Go!" Ethan shouted again, his voice breaking through the haze of panic. "Please, Sarah." I hesitated for a heartbeat longer, my eyes locked on his. The pain in his expression was unbearable, but beneath it was something else, an unspoken plea. He was doing this for me. He was giving me a chance to live. My legs finally moved. I turned and sprinted toward the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door. Behind me, I heard more gunshots, louder, faster. I didn't dare look back. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The road was a blur of darkness, the trees whipping past me, but all I could think about was Ethan. The sound of the gunfire, the look in his eyes as he told me to run. It all played over and over in my mind, like a nightmare I couldn't escape. I drove blindly, my heart pounding, my vision blurred by tears. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I was leaving him behind, and the guilt of that decision was already eating me alive. I drove for hours, not even sure where I was heading, until the adrenaline finally wore off and exhaustion took its place. My hands were still trembling when I pulled into a gas station off the highway, the dim lights flickering above me like ghosts. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, my mind racing. Ethan was gone, and I had left him. The tears came again, hot and angry. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, a sob choking out of me. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He wasn't supposed to die. Not like that. Not because of me. But deep down, I knew the truth. He hadn't died because of me. He had died for me. He had sacrificed himself so I could escape. And now I was alone, carrying the weight of that decision. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin as I stumbled toward the gas station. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. All I could see was Ethan, bleeding out on the ground, his eyes pleading with me to run. Inside the gas station, I found a dingy bathroom. I locked the door behind me and leaned against the sink, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was pale, my eyes red and swollen from crying. I looked like a stranger. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm the panic that still gripped my chest. But it didn't help. Nothing would help. I was running from something far bigger than myself, and I didn't even know where to turn. The next morning, I found myself sitting in a motel room miles from where everything had gone wrong. The silence of the room was suffocating, and the emptiness around me only made the weight of Ethan's absence more unbearable. I had no idea if he was dead or alive. I had no idea if the men who had hunted us down were still looking for me. But the worst part was the not knowing, whether I had made the right choice, or if leaving Ethan behind was something I would regret for the rest of my life. I stared at my phone, my finger hovering over the call button. Who would I even call? The police? They couldn't help. They were part of the system that had let this happen. I couldn't go home, couldn't trust anyone. I was completely alone. I replayed that last look Ethan had given me, the pain and the regret in his eyes as he begged me to run. He had done everything he could to keep me safe, and now I had to live with the fact that I might never know what became of him. Tears welled in my eyes again, but I blinked them away. There was no time for crying, no time for regret. Ethan had given me a chance to survive, and I couldn't let that be in vain. I stood up, grabbing my bag from the chair, and walked to the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the empty parking lot. Somewhere out there, danger was still waiting. I could feel it, lingering like a shadow that wouldn't let go. But I wasn't the same person I had been before. I had been dragged into a nightmare, but I had survived. And now, I had to keep moving. With one last glance at the room, I walked out, leaving the past behind. What do you think happened to Ethan? Could you live with the choice Sarah made? Share your thoughts on this intense conclusion.